It whispers that your bank balance is a reflection of your value. It convinces you that if you don't have money, you don't have power, respect, or importance. And slowly, without realizing it, people begin to shrink themselves to fit this belief. They start walking into rooms already feeling smaller, already feeling behind, already feeling like they are not enough. But if you look closely, this idea doesn't just hurt those who have less money, it also traps those who have more. Because once worth is tied to money, it is never stable. There is always someone richer, someone more successful, someone more visible. So even the people who seem to have everything often feel like they are still chasing something they cannot fully catch. The truth is simpler, but harder to accept. Your worth existed before money ever entered your life. It was there when you were a child, before you knew what success meant, before you compared yourself to anyone. It was there in the way you laughed without hesitation, in the way you were curious without fear, in the way you existed without needing validation. Nothing external created that worth, and nothing external can truly take it away. Think about a person you respect deeply. Not someone famous, not someone wealthy, but someone real. Maybe a teacher who changed your thinking, or a friend who stood by you when things were falling apart, or a family member who sacrificed quietly without ever asking for recognition. When you think about them, their value does not come from their bank account. It comes from their presence, their actions, their character, and yet, when it comes to yourself, you forget this completely. There was a man who worked in a small repair shop. He fixed broken radios, old fans, and sometimes things people had already given up on. He did not earn much. Most people would pass by his shop without noticing him. But those who knew him understood something different. Whenever someone came in frustrated, he didn't just fix the item. He listened. He calmed them. He treated their problem like it mattered. Over time, people didn't just come to him because he was skilled. They came because they felt seen. Now, if you measured his worth by money, you would miss everything that made him valuable. You would overlook the impact he had on people's lives. You would ignore the trust he built. You would reduce him to a number that says nothing about who he really is. And this is exactly what people do to themselves every day. The danger of linking worth to money is that it makes you blind to your own strengths. You start ignoring your ability to think deeply, to solve problems, to support others, to create ideas. You start believing that none of that matters unless it produces immediate financial results. And when that happens, you stop investing in yourself in ways that actually build long-term value. Real worth shows itself in moments that cannot be bought. It shows in discipline when no one is watching. It shows in honesty when lying would be easier. It shows in resilience when things are not working in your favor. These are not things you can purchase. They are things you build. And once built, they stay with you regardless of your financial situation. There is a story of a young man who lost everything in a failed business. Within a year, he went from being financially comfortable to struggling to pay rent. People who once respected him started avoiding him. Invitations stopped. Conversations changed. And for a while, he believed that his worth had disappeared along with his money. But something interesting happened. Because he had no resources left, he was forced to rely on his skills. He started helping others with small problems, offering advice, fixing things, connecting people. Slowly, people began to recognize something. Even without money, he still had value. In fact, the more he focused on what he could give instead of what he lacked, the more opportunities started coming back to him. What changed was not his bank account. What changed was his understanding of his own worth. Most people wait for money to feel confident. But confidence built on money is fragile. It rises and falls with circumstances. The kind of confidence that lasts is built on knowing what you bring to the table regardless of external conditions. It is built on knowing that even if everything is taken away, you still have something meaningful to offer. You see this clearly in people who have gone through hardship and rebuilt their lives. They often carry a different kind of presence. They are less desperate for approval, less afraid of failure, because they have already faced loss and discovered that their worth did not disappear with it. On the other hand, people who have always depended on external validation often struggle the most when things change. If their identity is tied to their job title, their income, or their lifestyle, then any disruption feels like a personal collapse, not because they have lost everything, but because they never built a sense of worth independent of those things. This is why understanding your worth without money is not just philosophical, it is practical. It gives you stability in unstable situations. It allows you to take risks without losing yourself. It frees you from constantly comparing your life to others. Imagine two people starting from the same place. One believes their worth depends entirely on financial success. The other believes their worth comes from their character, their skills, and their ability to grow. When both face failure, the first person feels destroyed. The second person feels challenged. The difference is not in the situation. It is in the belief. And over time, that belief shapes everything. It affects decisions, relationships, opportunities, and even mental health. There is also a hidden cost to undervaluing yourself. When you believe you are only as good as your financial situation, you begin to accept less than you deserve. You tolerate disrespect. You stay in environments that do not support your growth. You hesitate to express your ideas, not because you lack ability, but because you have convinced yourself that your voice does not carry weight. But when you recognize your intrinsic worth, your behavior changes. You set better boundaries. You invest in learning. You choose environments that align with your growth. You stop chasing validation and start building value. This does not mean money is unimportant. Money is a tool. It provides comfort, security, and opportunities. But it is not a measure of who you are. Confusing the two leads to a life where you are constantly chasing numbers without ever feeling fulfilled. The most powerful shift you can make is this: stop asking, "How much am I worth?" in terms of money, and start asking, "What value do I create?" Because value is something you can control. It is something you can grow. And unlike money, it cannot be taken away overnight. If you look at people who have built meaningful lives, you will notice a pattern. They focus on becoming valuable first, and the financial rewards follow later. Not always immediately, not always easily, but consistently over time. So the question is not whether you have worth. The question is whether you recognize it. Because once you do, your decisions change. Your confidence changes. Your trajectory changes, and that is where everything begins. Chapter 2. From the moment you begin to understand the world, you are quietly taught how to measure yourself. No one sits you down and explains it directly, but it is everywhere. In school, you are rewarded for marks. At home, you are praised for achievements. In society, you are noticed for success. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to connect your value with outcomes. You start believing that you are only as good as what you can show. This conditioning does not feel harmful at first. In fact, it often feels motivating. It pushes you to work harder, to achieve more, to stand out. But over time, it creates a dangerous pattern. You stop seeing yourself as inherently valuable and instead start seeing yourself as a project that must constantly prove its worth. The problem is not in striving for success. The problem is in believing that without it, you are nothing. Think about how often people introduce themselves. They mention their job, their degree, their achievements. Rarely do they talk about their character, their values, or the kind of person they are. It is not because those things do not matter. It is because society has trained them to believe that those things are secondary. There was a student who always ranked at the top of his class. For years, his identity was built on being the best. Teachers admired him, classmates respected him, and his family took pride in him. But when he entered a more competitive environment, something changed. Suddenly, he was no longer the top student. There were others who performed better, faster, stronger. For the first time, he felt lost. It was not because he had become less intelligent. It was because his sense of worth was tied to being number one. Without that position, he did not know who he was. His confidence dropped, his motivation faded, and he began to question his abilities. This is the hidden trap of conditional worth. When your value depends on external results, it becomes unstable. Every comparison, every setback, every delay feels like a threat to your identity. Now imagine a different approach. Imagine someone who still works hard, still aims high, but does not attach their entire identity to the outcome. They see success as something they pursue, not something that defines them. When they succeed, they are grateful. When they fail, they learn, but in both cases they remain grounded in who they are. This person is not less ambitious. In fact, they are often more consistent. Because they are not driven by fear of losing their worth, they are driven by a genuine desire to grow. One of the strongest influences on how you see your worth is comparison. It is almost automatic. You look at someone else's life, their achievements, their lifestyle, and you measure yourself against it. And because you only see the surface, you often feel like you are falling behind. But comparison is fundamentally flawed. It ignores context. It ignores timing. It ignores the invisible struggles that every person carries. Most importantly, it ignores your own unique path. There was a young woman who constantly compared herself to her peers. By a certain age, many of them had stable careers, higher incomes, and more visible success. She felt like she was late, like she had missed something important. This feeling affected her decisions. She rushed into opportunities that did not align with her strengths, simply because they looked successful from the outside. It took her years to realize that she was chasing someone else's definition of worth. When she finally stepped back and asked herself what she actually valued, everything began to shift. She started focusing on her strengths, her interests, and her long-term growth. The progress was slower at first, but it was real, and more importantly, it felt right. The need to prove your worth often comes from a deeper fear, the fear of being overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. Money, achievements, and status become tools to protect yourself from that fear. They become ways to say, "I matter." But the truth is, trying to prove your worth to everyone is exhausting. It keeps you in a constant state of pressure. You feel like you always have to do more, be more, achieve more, and no matter how much you accomplish, it never feels enough for long. There is a different path, but it requires a shift in perspective. Instead of trying to prove your worth, you begin to recognize it. Instead of chasing validation, you start building substance. Substance is what remains when external rewards are removed. It is your ability to think clearly, to adapt, to communicate, to solve problems, to support others. These are the qualities that create real impact. These are the qualities that make you valuable in any situation. Consider someone who is financially successful but lacks integrity. Over time, people begin to lose trust in them. Their relationships weaken. Their reputation becomes unstable. Now, consider someone with modest financial means but strong character. They are reliable, honest, and consistent. People trust them. Opportunities come to them not because of their wealth, but because of who they are. This is not idealism. It is practical reality. In the long run, character sustains what money alone cannot. Another important aspect of worth is how you treat yourself when things are not going well. Most people are kind to themselves when they succeed, but harsh when they fail. They use failure as evidence that they are not good enough. They speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to others. But if your worth is truly independent of outcomes, then failure is not a verdict. It is feedback. There was an entrepreneur who faced multiple failures before finding success. Each time something did not work, he analyzed what went wrong, adjusted his approach, and tried again. What allowed him to continue was not blind optimism. It was a stable sense of self. He did not see failure as a reflection of his worth, but as part of the process. Over time, this mindset compounded. While others gave up after a few setbacks, he kept moving, and eventually his efforts paid off. But the real success was not the financial outcome. It was the resilience he built along the way. When you detach your worth from money, something interesting happens. You become less afraid. Less afraid of starting, less afraid of failing, less afraid of being judged, because your identity is no longer at risk. This freedom is powerful. It allows you to explore, to experiment, to take calculated risks. It allows you to focus on long-term growth instead of short-term validation. At the same time, it changes how you see others. Instead of valuing people based on their financial status, you begin to notice deeper qualities. You appreciate integrity, effort, kindness, intelligence, creativity. Your relationships become more meaningful because they are not based on superficial measures. The world will continue to emphasize money as a measure of success. That will not change. But your relationship with that idea can change. You can choose to see money as a tool, not a definition. You can choose to build your worth on something more stable. You can choose to invest in qualities that grow over time instead of chasing metrics that fluctuate. This does not happen instantly. It requires awareness. It requires questioning beliefs that you have carried for years. It requires catching yourself in moments of comparison and reminding yourself of what truly matters. But with each small shift, your perspective strengthens. And once you begin to see your worth clearly, you stop negotiating it for temporary approval. You stop shrinking yourself to fit expectations. You stop waiting for external proof. You start building a life that reflects who you actually are, not just what you can show. And that is where real competence begins to take shape. Chapter 3. There is a moment in almost everyone's life when they feel invisible. Not completely unseen, but unnoticed in the way that matters. Their efforts go unrecognized, their presence feels ordinary, and their value seems to blend into the background. It is in these moments that the question quietly appears, do I really matter? Most people try to answer this question by looking outward. They search for signs in how others treat them, how much attention they receive, how much they earn, or how often they are acknowledged. And when those signals are weak or inconsistent, doubt begins to grow. But the problem is not the lack of recognition. The problem is where the recognition is being sought. External validation is unpredictable. It depends on other people's perceptions, priorities, and biases. Sometimes it comes easily, sometimes it disappears without explanation. If your sense of worth depends on it, then your confidence will always be unstable. There was a young professional who worked tirelessly in his organization. He stayed late, took on extra responsibilities, and consistently delivered quality work. Yet, when promotions were announced, his name was not on the list. Others who seemed less dedicated were moving ahead faster. At first, he felt frustrated. Then he started doubting himself. Maybe he was not as capable as he thought. Maybe his efforts did not matter. Maybe he was simply not good enough. What he did not realize was that his value had not decreased. The recognition had simply not aligned with it. This is a common experience. People often confuse lack of acknowledgement with lack of worth. But they are not the same. Recognition is external and selective. Worth is internal and constant. The danger of relying on external validation is that it slowly shifts your focus. Instead of asking, "Am I growing?" you begin asking, "Am I being noticed?" Instead of improving your skills, you start adjusting your behavior to gain approval. You begin to perform rather than develop. And over time, this creates a disconnect. You may achieve visible success, but feel empty. Or you may feel capable, but undervalued. In both cases, something feels off, because your sense of worth is not anchored. Consider someone who constantly seeks approval. They tailor their opinions to match others. They avoid expressing disagreement. They prioritize being liked over being authentic. In the short term, this may bring acceptance, but in the long term, it erodes self-respect. Because deep down, they know they are not being fully themselves. On the other hand, someone who understands their worth does not depend on constant validation. They still appreciate recognition, but they do not require it to function. They are able to stand by their ideas, even when they are not immediately accepted. They are able to continue their efforts, even when results are not visible. This does not mean they are unaffected by criticism or rejection. It means they are not defined by it. There was an artist who spent years creating work that very few people noticed. His pieces were thoughtful, detailed, and meaningful, but they did not gain attention. Friends advised him to change his style, to follow trends, to create what was popular. For a while, he considered it. The idea of being seen was tempting. But something held him back. He realized that if he changed his work just to gain attention, he would lose the very thing that made it valuable to him. So he continued, quietly, consistently. Years later, his work began to gain recognition. Not because he chased it, but because he stayed true to what he believed in. The recognition came, but it was not what defined his worth. It was simply a reflection of the value he had already built. This is an important distinction. When recognition becomes the goal, you become dependent on it. When value becomes the goal, recognition becomes a byproduct. Another challenge with external validation is that it often comes from people who do not fully understand your journey. They see outcomes, not effort. They see results, not struggles. Their judgment is based on limited information. If you rely on that judgment to define your worth, you are placing your identity in incomplete hands. There is also a subtle pressure in constantly seeking validation. It makes you cautious. You begin to avoid risks that might lead to criticism. You hesitate to try new things where you might not immediately succeed. You stay within boundaries that feel safe but limit your growth. But growth rarely happens in comfort. It happens when you step into uncertainty, when you attempt something challenging, when you accept the possibility of failure. If your worth is tied to always appearing successful, you will avoid the very experiences that lead to real development. Think about learning any new skill. In the beginning, you are not good at it. You make mistakes. You struggle, you feel awkward. If you judge your worth based on performance at this stage, you will likely give up. But if you separate your worth from your current ability, you allow yourself to continue. You give yourself space to improve. This is where internal validation becomes essential. Internal validation is not about ignoring feedback or believing you are perfect. It is about having a stable sense of self that does not collapse under external pressure. It is about recognizing your efforts, your progress, and your intentions, even when others do not. It is the ability to say, "I know I am improving," even if no one else notices yet. There was a woman training for a marathon. In the early stages, she could barely run a few kilometers without stopping. People around her did not take her seriously. Some even discouraged her, suggesting it was unrealistic. But she kept going, not because she was receiving encouragement, but because she believed in her own progress. She tracked her improvement, celebrated small milestones, and stayed consistent. Months later, she completed the marathon. To others, it looked like a sudden achievement, but to her, it was the result of countless unnoticed efforts. Her worth was not in the medal she received at the end. It was in the discipline she built along the way. When you develop internal validation, you change how you respond to the world. Praise becomes something you appreciate, not something you depend on. Criticism becomes something you evaluate, not something that defines you. You begin to filter external input instead of absorbing it completely. This gives you control. Without it, you are constantly reacting. With it, you are intentionally responding. It also changes how you handle silence. There will be times when your efforts are not acknowledged, times when your progress is not visible to others, times when it feels like nothing is happening. In those moments, external validation offers nothing. But internal validation keeps you steady. It reminds you why you started. It reminds you what you are building. It reminds you that value is not always immediately visible. This is especially important in a world where visibility is often mistaken for value. Social media, public recognition, and external achievements create the illusion that worth must be seen to exist. But some of the most valuable growth happens in private. It happens in the hours no one sees, in the effort no one praises, in the consistency that does not get attention. If you can learn to value those moments, you build something strong. Because at the end of the day, the most important relationship you have is with yourself. And if that relationship depends entirely on external approval, it will always feel uncertain. But if it is grounded in self-awareness, effort, and growth, it becomes stable. And from that stability, everything else begins to align. You stop chasing attention and start building substance. You stop performing and start becoming. And in that shift, you discover a different kind of confidence. One that does not need to be constantly proven, one that exists quietly but powerfully. And once you have that, you no longer feel invisible, because you no longer need the world to confirm what you already know. Chapter 4. There is a difference between being valuable and feeling valuable, and most people never notice the gap between the two. They spend years developing skills, gaining experience, and building character, yet still feel like they are behind. Not because they lack worth, but because they have trained themselves to ignore it. This disconnect does not happen suddenly. It develops over time through small patterns of thinking. Each time you dismiss your own effort, each time you minimize your progress, each time you compare your journey to someone else's highlight, you weaken your ability to recognize your own value. Eventually, it becomes automatic. You achieve something, and instead of acknowledging it, you think it's not a big deal. You improve, and instead of appreciating the growth, you think others are still ahead. You overcome a challenge, and instead of feeling stronger, you think, I should have done better. This constant dismissal creates an internal environment where nothing feels enough. There was a man who had built a stable career over several years. He had developed strong skills, earned respect in his field, and consistently delivered results. But whenever someone praised his work, he would deflect it. He would say things like, "It was nothing," or "anyone could have done it." At first, it seemed like humility. But over time, it became clear that it was not humility. It was an inability to accept his own worth. Because of this, he never fully felt confident. He hesitated to take on bigger opportunities. He undervalued his contributions. And in many cases, others began to undervalue him too, simply because he did not present himself with clarity. This is an important reality. How you see your worth influences how others see it. If you consistently downplay your value, people will assume it is not significant. If you hesitate to acknowledge your strengths, others will overlook them. Not always intentionally, but naturally. This does not mean you need to become arrogant or exaggerated. It means you need to become accurate. Accuracy is different from ego. Ego inflates, insecurity deflates. Accuracy simply recognizes what is real. If you have developed a skill, acknowledge it. If you have improved, recognize it. If you have contributed something meaningful, accept it. Not to impress others, but to align your internal perception with reality. There was a young woman who struggled with this balance. She had strong analytical skills and consistently provided valuable insights in her work, but in meetings she rarely spoke. She assumed that her ideas were not as strong as others. She waited for someone else to say something similar before she felt comfortable contributing. Over time, she noticed a pattern. When others presented ideas that were similar to hers, they were acknowledged and appreciated. Not because they were better, but because they were expressed. This realization changed her approach. She began to speak up, not aggressively, but clearly. She shared her thoughts without overthinking. And gradually her presence became stronger. Her contributions were recognized, and her confidence grew. Nothing about her ability had changed. What changed was her willingness to express her worth. Another factor that affects how you feel about your value is your relationship with progress. Most people focus only on outcomes. They measure success in final results, not in the steps taken to reach them. But progress is where real value is built. Imagine someone learning a complex skill. In the beginning, their performance is weak. Mistakes are frequent. Improvement is slow. If they judge their worth based only on current performance, they will feel inadequate. But if they pay attention to progress, something different happens. They notice that what once felt difficult is now manageable. They see that their understanding has deepened. They recognize that their effort is producing change. This awareness builds confidence, not because they have reached the end, but because they can see the movement. There was a student preparing for a difficult exam. At first, the material felt overwhelming. Scores on practice tests were low. It was easy to feel discouraged. But instead of focusing only on the scores, he began tracking his improvement. He noticed that topics that once confused him were becoming clearer. He saw that his mistakes were becoming more specific, not random. He realized that his approach was becoming more structured. By the time he took the final exam, his confidence was not based on certainty of success. It was based on evidence of growth. This is a key shift. When you start valuing progress, you reduce the pressure of perfection. You allow yourself to improve without constantly feeling like you are not enough. Another important element is how you define success. If success is defined only in financial terms, then your sense of worth will always be limited, because money is only one dimension of value. There are people who earn a lot but feel unfulfilled. There are people who earn less but feel deeply satisfied with their work and their impact. This does not mean money is irrelevant. It means it is incomplete as a measure. Success can also be defined by the quality of your work, the strength of your relationships, the consistency of your effort, and the alignment between your actions and your values. When you expand your definition of success, you create more ways to recognize your worth. There was a teacher who worked in a small community. Her income was modest, and her work did not receive public recognition. But over the years, she influenced hundreds of students. She helped them build confidence, develop skills, and believe in themselves. If you measured her success by money, you would underestimate her impact. But if you measured it by influence, by change, by long-term effect, her value becomes clear. The challenge is that these forms of value are not always immediately visible. They do not show up in numbers or rankings. They require a deeper level of awareness to recognize. This is why many people overlook their own worth. They are looking in the wrong places. They are looking for visible proof when their value may be developing in less obvious ways. They are looking for immediate results when their efforts are building long-term outcomes. They are looking for external confirmation when the evidence already exists internally. Another barrier to feeling valuable is the habit of focusing only on what is missing. It is easy to think about what you do not have, what you have not achieved, what you still need to improve. But this focus creates a constant sense of lack. If you only measure yourself by gaps, you will always feel incomplete. This does not mean you ignore areas of improvement. It means you balance awareness of what is missing with recognition of what is present. There was an individual who constantly felt behind in life. No matter what he achieved, he focused on what he had not yet done. This mindset kept him in a state of dissatisfaction. One day, he was asked a simple question: if someone else had your exact skills, experiences, and progress, would you consider them valuable? The answer was immediate. Yes. That moment revealed something important. He was applying a harsher standard to himself than he would to others. When he began to adjust this, his perspective shifted. He still aimed for growth, but he no longer ignored his current value. This balance is essential. You can recognize your worth and still want to improve. You can appreciate your progress and still aim higher. You can accept where you are without becoming complacent. In fact, this balance often leads to better results. Because when you are not constantly undermining yourself, you have more mental clarity, more focus, and more energy to invest in meaningful work. At its core, feeling valuable is not about convincing yourself of something that is not true. It is about removing the distortions that prevent you from seeing what is already there. It is about aligning your perception with reality. Because your worth does not suddenly appear when you reach a certain income level. It does not arrive when others finally recognize you. It does not depend on a specific milestone. It exists in your ability to think, to learn, to adapt, to contribute. And the more clearly you see that, the more confidently you begin to move, not with arrogance, not with insecurity, but with clarity. And that clarity changes everything. Because once you feel your value, you stop waiting for permission to act like it matters. Chapter 5. One of the most subtle ways people lose their sense of worth is through the quiet habit of over-attaching themselves to outcomes. It does not look dangerous at first. In fact, it often looks like ambition. You set goals, you work hard, and you want results. That seems reasonable, but somewhere along the way, the goal stops being something you pursue and starts becoming something that defines you. When that happens, every outcome begins to carry emotional weight far beyond what it should. Success feels like validation of your identity, and failure feels like a rejection of it. You are no longer just experiencing results, you are interpreting them as proof of who you are. There was a young man preparing for a competitive job opportunity. He invested months into preparation. He studied, practiced, and refined his approach. When the final result came and he was not selected, the disappointment was expected. But what followed was deeper. He did not just feel like he had failed at the task, he felt like he had failed as a person. This is the cost of attaching identity to outcomes. Because outcomes are influenced by many factors beyond your control. Timing, competition, external conditions, and even chance all play a role. If your worth is tied to something so variable, then your sense of self will always be unstable. The alternative is not to stop caring about results. It is to change your relationship with them. Instead of seeing outcomes as a reflection of your worth, you begin to see them as information. They tell you what worked, what did not, and where you can improve. They guide your actions, but they do not define your identity. This shift sounds simple, but it requires discipline, because your mind is naturally drawn to conclusions. It wants to label experiences quickly. It wants to say, "This happened, so it means this about me." Breaking that pattern takes awareness. There was an athlete who trained for years to compete at a high level. In one important event, he underperformed. For a brief moment, the thought appeared, maybe I'm not good enough. But instead of accepting that thought, he questioned it. He asked, what exactly went wrong? Was it preparation, execution, or strategy? By focusing on specifics instead of identity, he turned a potentially damaging experience into a useful one. He adjusted his training, improved his approach, and came back stronger. His worth did not change after that event, only his performance did. Another important aspect of detaching from outcomes is understanding the role of process. Most people focus on results because they are visible. They are easy to measure, but results are only the final expression of a process that happens over time. If you ignore the process and only focus on the result, you miss where real value is created. Imagine someone trying to build physical strength. If they only care about the final appearance, they may become impatient. They may push too hard, skip necessary steps, or give up when results are slow. But if they focus on the process, consistent training, proper nutrition, recovery, they begin to build something sustainable. The same principle applies to any area of life. There was a writer who wanted to publish a successful book. At first, he focused entirely on the outcome. He wanted recognition, sales, and impact. But this focus created pressure. Every page felt heavy, every delay felt like failure. Eventually, he shifted his attention. Instead of thinking about the final result, he committed to writing consistently each day. He focused on improving his craft, refining his ideas, and developing his voice. Over time, the work improved. Opportunities appeared. The outcome followed, but it was no longer the source of his motivation. This is the power of process-oriented thinking. When you focus on the process, you gain control. You can choose your effort, your discipline, your consistency. You can track your improvement. You can adjust your approach. When you focus only on outcomes, you give control away. You wait for results to determine how you feel. You become reactive instead of intentional. Another benefit of detaching from outcomes is that it reduces fear. Fear often comes from the possibility of negative results. The fear of failure, rejection, or loss of status can prevent you from taking action. But when your worth is not tied to the outcome, the fear loses its intensity. You begin to see challenges as opportunities to learn rather than threats to your identity. There was a woman who wanted to start her own venture. She had ideas, skills, and motivation, but she hesitated for years. The fear of failure held her back. Not because of the financial risk, but because of what failure might say about her. When she finally shifted her perspective, something changed. She decided that even if the venture did not succeed, it would not define her worth. It would simply be an experience, a lesson, a step forward. With that mindset, she started. The early stages were difficult. There were setbacks, mistakes, and moments of doubt. But instead of interpreting these as signs of inadequacy, she treated them as part of the process. Over time, she improved. The venture grew. But more importantly, her confidence became stronger and more stable, because it was no longer dependent on perfect outcomes. There is also a deeper layer to this idea. When you detach your worth from outcomes, you begin to act from a place of intention rather than desperation. Desperation comes from needing a specific result to feel okay. It creates pressure, impatience, and sometimes poor decisions. You may rush, compromise your values, or take shortcuts. Intention, on the other hand, comes from clarity. You know what you are working towards, but you are not defined by it. You can make better decisions because you are not driven by fear. This difference is often visible in how people approach opportunities. Someone driven by desperation might accept any offer, chase any trend, or follow any path that promises quick results. Someone driven by intention evaluates options more carefully. They consider alignment, long-term impact, and sustainability. This does not mean they move slowly. It means they move deliberately. Another important shift is how you interpret time. When your worth is tied to outcomes, delays feel like failures. You expect results within a certain time frame, and when they do not appear, you begin to doubt yourself. But when you focus on process and detach from outcomes, time becomes an ally instead of an enemy. You understand that meaningful progress takes time. You become more patient, not passive, but steady. You continue your efforts without constantly questioning your value. There was an individual learning a complex technical skill. In the beginning, progress was slow. It was easy to feel frustrated. Others seemed to advance faster. Results were not immediately visible. But instead of rushing or comparing, he stayed consistent. He focused on understanding the fundamentals, practicing regularly, and improving step by step. Months later, the difference became clear. His foundation was strong. His skills were reliable. While others struggled with gaps in their knowledge, he moved with confidence. His success was not sudden. It was the result of a steady process. This is the kind of growth that lasts. At its core, detaching your worth from outcomes allows you to engage with life more fully. You are not constantly calculating what each experience means about you. You are not holding back because of fear. You are not overreacting to temporary results. You are simply doing the work, learning from it, and moving forward. This does not eliminate disappointment. You will still feel it when things do not go as planned. But the difference is that disappointment does not turn into self-doubt. It remains what it is, a natural response to an undesired outcome. And from that place, you can recover more quickly, because your foundation is stable. You know that your worth is not something that can be lost in a single moment. You know that results are part of the journey, not the definition of it. And with that understanding, you begin to approach life differently, with less fear, with more clarity, with a deeper sense of control, not over everything that happens, but over how you respond. And that is where real strength begins to show. Chapter 6. There is a quiet power in knowing your worth, but there is an even greater power in protecting it. Many people reach a point where they begin to understand that their value is not defined by money or external success. They start to see their strengths more clearly. They become more aware of their abilities and their potential. But then something unexpected happens. Despite this awareness, they continue to place themselves in environments that slowly erode that sense of worth. This is where boundaries become essential. Without boundaries, your understanding of your worth remains theoretical. It exists in your mind, but not in your actions. And over time, this creates internal conflict. You know you deserve better, but you continue to accept less. There was a man who had developed strong professional skills. He was reliable, hardworking, and consistently delivered quality results. But in his workplace, he was often overloaded with responsibilities that were beyond his role. He rarely said no. He wanted to be seen as dependable, as someone who could handle anything. At first, this earned him appreciation, but over time, it turned into expectation. More work was assigned without additional support. His efforts were taken for granted. And gradually, his sense of value began to decline, not because he lacked ability, but because he was not protecting it. This is a common pattern. When you do not set boundaries, people adjust to your limits, not your potential. They respond to what you allow. Boundaries are not about being difficult or uncooperative. They are about being clear. They define what is acceptable and what is not. They communicate your standards without needing constant explanation. One of the reasons people struggle with boundaries is the fear of losing approval. Saying no can feel uncomfortable. It can create tension. It can lead to misunderstanding. And for someone who has relied on external validation, this discomfort feels risky. But there is a hidden cost to always saying yes. Each time you ignore your own limits, you send a message to yourself that your needs are less important. Each time you accept treatment that does not align with your value, you reinforce the belief that you have to earn basic respect. Over time, this weakens your sense of self. There was a woman who found herself constantly available to others. Friends, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances would rely on her for support. She rarely refused. She wanted to be helpful, to be appreciated, to be seen as kind. But eventually, she became exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. She realized that while she was always there for others, very few people were there for her in the same way. This realization was difficult. It forced her to confront a pattern she had never questioned. When she began to set boundaries, the response was mixed. Some people understood and respected her limits. Others reacted negatively. They were used to her constant availability and saw her change as withdrawal. This is another reality of boundaries. Not everyone will respond positively. Some people benefit from your lack of boundaries, and when that changes, they feel uncomfortable. But this discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is often a sign that you are doing something necessary. Over time, her relationships began to shift. The ones that were based on mutual respect remained strong. The ones that depended on her overgiving began to fade. And in that process, she gained something more valuable than approval. She gained self-respect. Self-respect is built through action. It comes from consistently aligning your behavior with your values. It grows when you make decisions that support your well-being, even when they are uncomfortable. Another important aspect of protecting your worth is the environments you choose. Your surroundings have a powerful influence on how you see yourself. If you are constantly in spaces where your efforts are ignored, where your contributions are undervalued, or where negativity dominates, it becomes difficult to maintain a strong sense of worth. Even the most confident individuals can be affected by the wrong environment over time. No matter how much effort was put in, the focus was always on what was missing. Over time, this began to affect their confidence. They started questioning their abilities, not because they had declined, but because their environment distorted their perception. Eventually, they moved to a different setting. In this new environment, feedback was still present, but it was balanced. Effort was acknowledged. Growth was supported. Within months, their confidence returned. Nothing about their ability had changed. Only the environment had. This highlights an important truth. While your worth is internal, your perception of it can be influenced externally. That is why it is important to be intentional about where you invest your time and energy. Protecting your worth also means being selective about whose opinions you value. Not all feedback is equal. Some people offer insight based on experience and understanding. Others speak from assumptions, biases, or limited perspectives. If you treat all opinions as equally valid, you will constantly feel pulled in different directions. There was a young professional who received conflicting advice from different people. Some encouraged risk-taking. Others advised caution. Some valued stability. Others prioritized growth. At first, this created confusion. It felt like no matter what decision was made, it would be wrong in someone's eyes. Eventually, a simple shift helped. Instead of trying to satisfy everyone, they began to evaluate the source of each opinion. They asked, does this person have the experience or perspective that aligns with where I want to go? This filter brought clarity. It allowed them to consider feedback without being overwhelmed by it. Another layer of protecting your worth is how you respond to disrespect. Disrespect does not always appear in obvious forms. Sometimes it is subtle. It shows in being consistently overlooked, in having your time undervalued, in being spoken to without consideration. Many people tolerate these behaviors longer than they should, often because they are unsure whether their reaction is justified. But a simple guideline can help. If a behavior consistently makes you feel diminished, it is worth addressing. This does not mean reacting aggressively. It means responding with clarity. There was an individual who noticed that their ideas were often dismissed in group discussions, only to be accepted when repeated by someone else. Instead of staying silent, they began to calmly restate their point and claim their contribution. Over time, this changed how others engaged with them. Respect is often reinforced through consistency. When you consistently acknowledge your own value, others begin to adjust. At the same time, it is important to recognize that not every situation can be controlled. There will be environments and individuals who do not respond to your boundaries or your efforts. In such cases, the most effective decision may be to step away. Walking away is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of clarity. It shows that you understand your worth is not dependent on any single situation. It shows that you are willing to choose long-term well-being over short-term comfort. Protecting your worth is not about creating distance from everyone. It is about creating alignment. It is about building relationships where respect is mutual. It is about choosing environments where growth is possible. It is about making decisions that reflect your value, not just your fears. This process is not always easy. It requires honesty. It requires courage. It requires letting go of certain patterns and, sometimes, certain people. But the result is stability. When your boundaries are clear, your energy is better managed. When your environment is supportive, your growth is stronger. When your self-respect is intact, your confidence becomes more consistent. And most importantly, you no longer feel the need to prove your worth in every situation. Because you are no longer placing yourself in spaces that question it. You are choosing spaces that recognize it. And that choice changes the direction of your life, because where you place yourself determines what you become. And once you begin to protect your worth, you stop allowing the world to define it for you. Chapter 7. There comes a point where understanding your worth is no longer enough. You begin to see your value, you start setting boundaries, you detach from outcomes, but something still feels incomplete. That missing piece is expression. Because worth that is not expressed often remains invisible, not just to others, but eventually to yourself. Many people carry value within them that never fully reaches the surface. Not because it is not real, but because it is not communicated, not applied, not acted upon. And over time, unused value begins to feel like it does not exist. There was a man who had spent years learning, observing, and developing deep insight in his field. He understood problems clearly, often better than those around him. But he rarely spoke. He assumed that if his ideas were truly valuable, they would be noticed without him having to say anything. They were not. Not because the ideas lacked quality, but because value that is hidden cannot be recognized. The world does not reward potential. It responds to what is visible, what is applied, what is shared. This is where many people struggle. They confuse humility with silence. They believe that expressing their abilities is a form of arrogance. They hold back, waiting for the right moment or for someone else to acknowledge them first. But that moment rarely comes. There is a difference between arrogance and clarity. Arrogance exaggerates value. Clarity communicates it accurately. When you express your thoughts, your skills, and your ideas with honesty, you are not trying to prove superiority. You are allowing your value to exist in a form that others can engage with. There was a young woman who had strong problem-solving abilities, but struggled to communicate them. In meetings, she would often stay quiet, even when she had solutions. She believed that speaking up required absolute certainty, and since she was always refining her thoughts, she hesitated. Over time, she noticed something important. Others who were less prepared but more expressive were being recognized. Their ideas were not always better, but they were present. This realization led to a shift. She began to share her thoughts more openly. Not perfectly, not with complete certainty, but consistently. At first it felt uncomfortable. But gradually her confidence grew. Her ideas began to shape decisions. Her presence became stronger. Her value had always been there. It simply needed expression. Expression is not limited to speaking. It shows in your actions, your decisions, your work, and how you carry yourself. It is the way your internal value interacts with the external world. If you know you are capable but consistently choose environments or roles that do not require that capability, your sense of worth begins to weaken, not because your value has decreased, but because it is not being used. There was an individual working in a role far below their potential. The work was repetitive and did not challenge their abilities. At first it felt comfortable. There was no pressure, no risk. But over time, something changed. They began to feel restless, disconnected, and dissatisfied. This feeling was not about money, it was about misalignment. When your abilities are not engaged, your sense of purpose begins to fade. You start questioning yourself, not because you lack worth, but because you are not experiencing it in action. When this individual eventually moved into a more demanding role, the transition was difficult. There were moments of doubt, moments of struggle. But there was also growth. Their skills expanded, their confidence increased, and their sense of worth became more tangible. Because it was now being expressed. Another barrier to expression is the fear of judgment. The fear that if you speak, act, or present yourself openly, you will be criticized or misunderstood. This fear is natural. But it becomes limiting when it prevents you from showing up fully. There was a creator who wanted to share ideas publicly. They had knowledge, perspective, and a unique way of thinking. But each time they considered publishing their work, doubt appeared. What if people disagree? What if it is not good enough? What if it is ignored? These questions delayed action for months. Eventually, they made a decision. Instead of waiting for certainty, they started sharing consistently. The early response was small. Not many people noticed. Some feedback was critical. But something important happened. They improved. With each piece of content, their clarity increased. Their confidence grew. Their voice became stronger, and over time, their audience expanded. If they had waited for perfect conditions, they would still be waiting. Expression requires acceptance of imperfection. You will not always say things perfectly. You will not always perform at your highest level. But without action, there is no feedback, and without feedback, there is no growth. Another important aspect of expression is ownership. When you take ownership of your value, you stop waiting for permission. You stop needing constant reassurance. You begin to act with a sense of responsibility for what you bring. There was a professional who always waited to be assigned tasks. Even when they saw opportunities to contribute, they hesitated. They believed that stepping forward without being asked might be seen as overstepping, but this approach limited their growth. When they shifted their mindset and began to take initiative, everything changed. They identified problems, proposed solutions, and took responsibility for execution. This did not just increase their visibility, it strengthened their sense of ownership. They were no longer just participating, they were contributing. Ownership also changes how you handle mistakes. When you avoid responsibility, mistakes feel like threats. You try to hide them or shift blame, but when you take ownership, mistakes become part of the process. You address them, learn from them, and move forward. This builds trust, both with others and with yourself. Expression is also closely connected to courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. There will always be reasons to hold back. There will always be uncertainty. But waiting for fear to disappear is not a strategy. Acting in its presence is. There was a moment in someone's life where they had an opportunity to speak in front of an audience. It was not a large event, but it mattered. They had something meaningful to share, but the fear of speaking publicly was strong. For a moment, they considered declining. But they chose to step forward. The delivery was not perfect. There were pauses, moments of hesitation, but the message was clear. And more importantly, it was delivered. Afterward, something shifted. The fear did not disappear, but it reduced. Confidence did not suddenly become complete, but it increased. Because action had replaced avoidance. Each time you express your value, even in small ways, you reinforce your sense of worth. You create evidence. You move from thinking to doing. And this is where everything begins to connect. Understanding your worth gives you clarity. Protecting your worth gives you stability. Detaching from outcomes gives you freedom. But expressing your worth gives you impact. Without expression, your value remains internal. With expression, it becomes real in the world. It influences decisions, shapes opportunities, and creates change. And perhaps most importantly, it allows you to experience your own worth directly, not as an idea, not as a belief, but as something you actively live. Because in the end, your worth is not just something to be understood, it is something to be used. And when you begin to use it fully, you stop questioning whether it exists. You start seeing what it can create. Chapter 8. It is one thing to feel strong when everything is going well, and another to remain grounded when life becomes uncertain. This is where many people struggle again. Not because they lack awareness, but because they underestimate how easily external pressure can pull them back into old patterns. There are moments in life when things do not go as planned. Efforts do not produce results, opportunities do not appear. Progress feels slow or even invisible. In these phases, the mind begins to drift. Doubt quietly returns. Old beliefs resurface. Maybe I am not as capable as I thought. Maybe others are just better. Maybe this is not for me. These thoughts are not new. They are echoes of earlier conditioning. And if you are not careful, they can slowly weaken everything you have built. There was an individual who had made significant progress in their career. They had developed skills, built confidence, and created opportunities for themselves. For a while, everything seemed to be moving forward. Then, unexpectedly, things slowed down. Projects were delayed. Recognition decreased. New opportunities became limited. At first, they remained calm. They trusted the process. But as time passed, frustration began to build. They started comparing themselves again. They questioned their direction. They wondered if their earlier progress had just been luck. This is the test of internal stability. It is easy to believe in your worth when results are visible. It is harder when they are not. The difference lies in what you rely on during these moments. If your sense of worth still depends on external confirmation, even slightly, these phases will feel like regression. But if your worth is grounded internally, you begin to interpret these periods differently. You see them as part of the cycle, not as a final judgment. There is a rhythm to growth that is often overlooked. It is not always upward. There are phases of expansion and phases of consolidation. Times when progress is visible and times when it is internal. But because people are conditioned to expect constant visible improvement, they misinterpret quieter phases as failure. There was a craftsman who spent years refining his skill. In the early stages, progress was noticeable. Each project was better than the last. Improvement was clear. But after a certain point, the changes became subtle. He was still improving, but it was not as obvious. The difference between his current work and his previous work was small, but significant. To an untrained eye, it looked like he had stopped progressing. But in reality, he had entered a deeper level of refinement. This is how growth often works. In the beginning, changes are large and visible. Later, they become precise and internal. If you are only looking for dramatic progress, you will miss the quieter improvements that actually define mastery. Another challenge in sustaining your worth is dealing with setbacks that are beyond your control. There are times when external factors disrupt your plans. Economic conditions change. Organizations shift. Opportunities disappear. These events can create a sense of instability, even if your abilities remain intact. There was a professional who had built a strong position in their field. They were skilled, respected, and consistent, but due to organizational restructuring, their role was eliminated. This was not a reflection of their ability, it was a structural decision. Yet, the emotional impact was real. It felt like a loss of identity, a disruption of stability. In such moments, it becomes critical to separate circumstance from self. Your situation can change without your worth changing. This distinction allows you to respond effectively. Instead of internalizing the setback, you can focus on adaptation. You can reassess, reposition, and move forward without carrying unnecessary self-doubt. Resilience is often misunderstood as simply enduring difficulty. But true resilience is the ability to maintain your sense of self while navigating change. It is the ability to remain steady internally, even when external conditions are unstable. There was a person who faced repeated rejection while pursuing a goal. Applications were declined. Opportunities did not materialize. Feedback was limited. It would have been easy to conclude that the goal was unattainable, but instead of drawing that conclusion, they focused on what they could control. They improved their approach. They refined their skills. They adjusted their strategy. Each rejection became data, not a verdict. Over time, the pattern shifted. Opportunities began to appear. Progress resumed, but the most important change was internal. They no longer saw rejection as a reflection of their worth. They saw it as part of the process. Another key element in sustaining your worth is consistency. Not intensity, not occasional bursts of motivation, but steady, reliable effort over time. Many people rely on motivation to guide their actions. When they feel inspired, they act. When they do not, they pause. But motivation is inconsistent. It rises and falls. Consistency, on the other hand, creates stability. There was an individual who wanted to develop a new skill. In the beginning, they approached it with high energy. They spent long hours practicing, pushing themselves intensely, but this approach was not sustainable. After a few weeks, the intensity dropped, progress slowed. Eventually, they changed their strategy. Instead of relying on motivation, they committed to a consistent routine. Smaller efforts, repeated daily. At first it felt less impressive. But over time, the results accumulated. Months later, the difference was clear. Consistency had achieved what intensity alone could not. This principle applies not just to skills, but to maintaining your sense of worth. When you consistently act in alignment with your values, your confidence becomes more stable. When you consistently invest in your growth, your sense of progress remains intact. When you consistently reinforce your boundaries, your self-respect strengthens. Another aspect that supports long-term stability is reflection. Without reflection, it is easy to lose perspective. You focus only on the present moment, often emphasizing what is missing. But when you take time to look back, you begin to see how far you have come. There was a person who felt stuck in their journey. Progress seemed slow. Results were not as visible as they had hoped. One day, they reviewed their past work, their earlier efforts, their previous challenges. The difference was undeniable. What once felt difficult was now manageable. What once seemed impossible had been achieved. This reflection did not create new value. It revealed existing value. It provided evidence that growth was happening, even if it was not immediately visible. Sustaining your worth also requires patience. Not passive waiting, but active persistence. It is the understanding that meaningful change takes time. It is the ability to continue your efforts without immediate validation. There will always be moments where progress feels slow. There will always be periods where results are delayed. But if your worth is tied only to immediate outcomes, these moments will feel unbearable. If your worth is grounded in your effort, your growth, and your consistency, these moments become manageable. They become part of the journey, not interruptions to it. At its core, sustaining your worth is about stability. It is about building a foundation that does not shift with every change in circumstance. It is about developing a mindset that remains steady even when external conditions fluctuate. Because life will not always move in a straight line. There will be uncertainty. There will be setbacks. There will be periods of doubt. But if your sense of worth is stable, you will not be easily shaken. You will adjust without losing yourself. You will adapt without questioning your value. You will continue without needing constant reassurance. And over time, this stability becomes one of your greatest strengths. Because while others are waiting for conditions to improve before they feel confident, you are already moving forward. Not because everything is perfect, but because your foundation does not depend on it. And that is what allows you to keep building, even when the path is unclear.